The neighborhood wasn't fancy, but it was hers. Margaret Chen had bought the corner lot property 15 years ago, a modest 1970s ranch with outdated plumbing and a dream. She'd spent 7 summers rebuilding that house herself, learning YouTube tutorials at 2 a.m., developing calluses on her palms, and transforming the overgrown backyard into something worth inheriting to her son. The pool was her masterpiece. She'd saved for 4 years. Liquidated her retirement. Hired contractors and then fired 3 of them before finding Marcus, an older Mexican man who understood the vision, an in-ground zero-edge pool that seemed to spill into the landscape, with a surrounding natural stone deck and native plantings that made it look like a resort sanctuary tucked into the suburbs. It took 6 months. It cost more than she'd budgeted. It was flawless. That was 3 years ago. The neighborhood wasn't the type to notice such things quietly. Margaret knew this. She'd lived on Bellbrook Avenue long enough to understand its rhythms, its jealousies, its quiet wars fought through HOA meetings and passive-aggressive ring camera footage. She'd made her peace with being the woman who'd upgraded her property while everyone else let theirs calcify. She wasn't showy about it. She didn't host parties. She didn't invite people to admire it. But she used it. Every warm evening after work, she'd change into her black one-piece and swim 40 laps. Meditative. Disciplined. The same way she did everything. Her ex-husband used to call her robotic. He'd left 3 years ago for someone softer. Margaret had thrown herself into the pool renovation instead. 18 months of that grief, now converted into tile and concrete and water that moved like silk. She never expected anyone to care. Then Karen moved in next door. Karen's family took the Jacobson place in late May, a 2-story colonial that had sat empty for 8 months. Margaret watched the moving trucks arrive with the mild curiosity of someone who'd learned not to expect new neighbors to be interesting. The man, David, seemed invisible, always leaving early, coming home late. But Karen was the kind of person you couldn't help but notice. She was always outside. Not gardening. Not walking. But present. Observing. Karen had a way of appearing at the property line precisely when Margaret was swimming, leaning against the fence with her arms crossed, watching. She was younger than Margaret by maybe 5 years, mid-50s, with the aggressive blonde bob of a woman who'd recently discovered dental veneers and wanted the world to see them. Margaret's son, Joshua, had returned home after college for the summer, sleeping in the guest room and working retail at the mall. He was 22, kind, and still optimistic about humanity in a way Margaret had surrendered years ago. He'd noticed Karen too. "Mom, she's always there," Joshua said one evening, handing Margaret a towel as she emerged from the pool, chlorine streaming from her dark hair. "I know. Like, always. It's weird. People are weird, Joshua. Best not to engage." But Margaret had engaged, despite her better instincts. 2 weeks after Karen moved in, she'd found Karen and David's teenage son, Tyler, trying to fish something out of the pool with a pool skimmer. A soccer ball that had been kicked from their yard. Margaret had been civil about it. She'd retrieved the ball. She'd even offered Tyler a Gatorade on a 95-degree afternoon. That was her mistake. Not the Gatorade. The offer. The acknowledgement that kindness could exist between properties. Tyler had taken the Gatorade and drunk it in 3 long gulps, his eyes darting nervously over the pool like it contained treasure he wasn't allowed to touch. "Your pool is sick," he'd said. "Thank you. Do you ever have parties?" Margaret remembered this moment later, how clearly she should have seen it. How a woman with her experience should have recognized the opening of a door she never wanted unlocked. "No," she'd said. "I don't." The next day, Karen appeared at the gate. Not at the property line. At the gate. It was 6 p.m., and Margaret was preparing for her evening swim, already in her suit, towel draped across her shoulders. Karen wore sunglasses despite the sun hanging low on the horizon, and her expression held something that Margaret would come to recognize as the specific expression of someone who'd already decided what they wanted. "Hi, neighbor," Karen had said, and her voice carried the false warmth of network news anchors. "I wanted to introduce myself properly. I'm Karen Whitmore. We haven't had a proper chance to chat." Margaret had not invited her inside the gate. But somehow, over the course of the next 20 minutes, Karen had made it clear that she understood Margaret's pool. That she appreciated aesthetic choices. That she, too, was a woman of taste in a neighborhood that sorely lacked it. Most people wouldn't take the risk, Karen had said, circling the pool deck with her hands clasped in front of her like a museum patron. Most people would go with a builder-grade rectangle and call it a day. But you understood that a pool could be architecture. Could be art. Margaret had felt something dangerous then, the pleasure of being seen, of having her work recognized by another adult who inhabited the same class of aesthetic consciousness. It was a dangerous thing, that recognition. It made her lower her guard. "Thank you," Margaret had said. "Tyler has been talking about it all week. He's really into pool design, you know. Does landscape architecture in school. He'd love to just study it. If you ever wanted to let him come over, just to observe, no swimming or anything. He's very responsible." The request had been so reasonable. The phrasing so careful. Margaret should have heard the trap closing. "Maybe," she'd said, which Karen had clearly translated to yes. 2 days later, Tyler had appeared at the gate with a notebook, and Margaret, feeling generous and perhaps lonely in a way she wouldn't admit, had let him in. That was 6 weeks ago. Now, on a Tuesday evening in early August, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her coffee growing cold, staring at her phone. On the screen was an email from the city's Parks and Recreation Department. Subject: Public Amenity Registration. The email informed her that a complaint had been filed regarding her pool, which had allegedly been used by neighborhood children without proper liability insurance or safety protocols. The city was investigating whether her pool constituted a public nuisance, or whether she was operating an unlicensed recreational facility. The email was dated 4 days ago. She'd missed it because it had gone to her spam folder. There was a second email, sent just that morning, from the city's zoning office, requesting documentation of her pool's permit status and any liability insurance she maintained. Margaret's hands were shaking. She called Marcus, her pool contractor. "Did you register this with the city?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Of course, Hermosa. Everything legal. Everything by the book. I need the permit documentation." She found it 40 minutes later, every form properly filed, every signature in place, every regulation met. Her pool was legal. It was private. It was, by every measure, entirely her own. But the complaint had been filed. Someone had called the city and described her pool as a place where neighborhood children had unsupervised access, and where the property owner had not taken adequate safety precautions. Margaret sat in her living room and watched the sunset paint the sky the color of old bruises. She thought about Tyler with his notebook, appearing twice more over the past 6 weeks. She thought about Karen's phone always in her hand, always photographing. She thought about the way Karen's expression had shifted when Margaret had mentioned she was planning to refinance her mortgage, something Karen had never asked about, but which Margaret had volunteered, the way you do when someone is playing the role of confidant. "I'm thinking about renovating the kitchen next," Margaret had said. "I've been saving." Karen's eyes had done something sharp then. A quick calculation, visible as a shadow. The sun dipped below the fence line, and Margaret stood up. She walked to the back sliding door and looked out at her pool, illuminated now by the subtle landscape lighting she'd installed. The water reflected the light back like contained stars. She locked the back door. She locked it with the deliberateness of someone who'd understood, at last, that other people were not to be trusted with your private things. Not with kindness. Not with recognition. Not with the vulnerable parts of yourself that you'd built with your own hands. The next morning, Margaret went to the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty padlock and chain. She installed them on the gate herself, working with the efficient, emotionless precision that had always been her superpower. The lock was expensive, serious, the kind that suggested legal consequence. She sent a message to Tyler through the neighborhood app: "The pool is now private and off-limits. No access. No exceptions." Within an hour, Karen had responded in the same thread: "That's very unfortunate. Tyler was really learning so much. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding with the city. Have you considered just opening it up to the neighborhood? We could draft a liability waiver." Margaret did not respond. But that evening, as she prepared for her swim, she heard the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway next door. She recognized it immediately: David's truck, hours earlier than usual. Through the fence, she could see him conferring with Karen in the yard, could see Karen's arms animated, could see David's shoulders slump with the defeated posture of a man who'd been made to listen to something he didn't want to hear. Margaret locked her sliding door, changed into her suit, and dove into the pool. The water was perfect. Exactly the right temperature. She'd always maintained it that way: meticulous, controlled, perfected. She swam her 40 laps. She didn't look toward the fence line, though she could feel the weight of observation from the other side. When she emerged, there was a notice taped to her gate. Her hands went cold before she even read it. "Cease and desist, unlicensed recreational facility." It was dated that morning. It had come from the city, but the legal language and the specificity of the violation seemed too precise to have originated from the typical bureaucratic machinery. Someone had lawyered up. Someone had filed a more serious complaint. Margaret's stomach dropped as she understood it: Karen hadn't just called the city. Karen had called a lawyer. Karen had documented everything. Karen had built a case. And Margaret had locked the gate, which made her look guilty of something: arrogance, self-awareness, fear. She went inside and sat down on her living room couch. She didn't cry. Margaret didn't do that. But she understood, with absolute clarity, that she'd been played. That the pool, which had been her sanctuary, her masterpiece, her proof that she could create something beautiful through sheer will and sacrifice, was now a liability. The lawyer's letter came on Thursday. David Whitmore's name was at the bottom: he'd apparently been the one to hire her. The letter outlined Margaret's violations in meticulous detail, each one a small cut. Unlicensed recreational facility operated within residential zone. Insufficient liability insurance for public use property. Hazardous chemical storage adjacent to neighborhood walkway. Operating an active construction site without proper permits during pool installation, 2021. That last one was infuriating in its specificity. They'd gone back in time, mining old complaints, resurrecting issues that had been resolved years ago. Margaret's hands shook as she read it. The letter demanded that she either A. Apply for proper licensing to operate the pool as a public recreational facility, including installation of lifeguards, safety equipment, and adherence to municipal swimming codes. B. Drain the pool entirely. C. Accept a lawsuit for damages to be determined, citing environmental hazard concerns and unlicensed operation of a public nuisance. There was no version of this that ended with Margaret keeping her pool as it was. She called an attorney, Patricia Song, a woman her age who worked out of a strip mall office and who'd handled her divorce. Patricia listened to the entire situation without interrupting, then let out a long breath. "Margaret, this is aggressive. And specific. They're not just calling the city. They're filing for injunctive relief. That means they want the pool gone. Not regulated. Gone. On what grounds? The city records support them. During the original construction, you operated without a temporary construction permit for the first month. Your contractor should have handled it, but it appears he didn't file it until after the city's inspector mentioned it. That was resolved. Yes, but it's still on record. And the issue of liability, they're arguing that because you've allowed neighborhood children access, you've established a pattern of public use, which makes you liable for any injuries that might occur. They're essentially saying you've created an attractive nuisance. Margaret felt something cold and certain settle in her chest. This was going to be expensive. This was going to be a war. What's my best option? She asked. Honestly? Apply for the licensing. Get the pool properly classified as a commercial recreational facility. It'll be expensive, and you'll have ongoing compliance costs, but at least you keep it. It's in my residential backyard. I'll never get approval for that. There are no residential pools licensed as commercial facilities. Then the other option is to drain it, Patricia said quietly. I'm sorry. Margaret hung up the phone. She sat in her kitchen, which was still dated from 2008, which she'd been planning to renovate with the equity from refinancing her mortgage. The kitchen she'd been going to tackle next, the way you do when you're methodically improving your own life. She thought about how much the pool had cost. She thought about the work. She thought about the fact that she was now facing legal fees that would dwarf the pool's original installation. She thought about Karen watching from the fence. That afternoon, Joshua came home from work. He found his mother sitting in the living room in the dark, still in her work clothes from the office where she managed billing systems for a medical group. Mom. You okay? Margaret handed him the cease and desist letter. Joshua read it with the careful attention he brought to everything. When he finished, he looked up at his mother with eyes that still contained some of the softness of childhood, even though he was legally an adult. These people are being insane, he said. It's your pool. In your yard. You didn't do anything wrong. I let their son come look at it. So. That was nice. That was generous. Margaret had never told Joshua about the complaint to the city. She'd protected him from that knowledge. But now she told him everything, about Karen's obsessive watching, about the pattern of conversation that had seemed like friendship but which she now recognized as intelligence gathering, about the strategic building of a case. Joshua listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I'm going to talk to Tyler, he finally said. Joshua, no. Mom. Tyler's a good kid. He's not the problem here. His parents are insane, but he's not. He might not even know what they're doing. I could ask him. I could find out if he's actually interested in landscape architecture or if that was just a way to get access. Margaret wanted to say no. But she was desperate enough to let her 22-year-old son become an unwitting operative in this territory war. Joshua ran into Tyler at the mall the next day. Tyler worked at a Hollister in the food court, and Joshua caught him during his break, and they talked for 20 minutes on a bench outside the Apple store. Afterward, Joshua reported back. He had no idea, Joshua said. Like, genuinely. He thought you were cool with him coming by. He thought you were proud of him for being interested in design. His parents told him you'd explicitly invited him over to mentor him. They lied. Or they just rewrote it. Mom, I think they really did plan this. I think they saw your pool and decided they wanted it, and when you said no to opening it up, they just escalated. They can't want my pool, Margaret said. But even as she said it, she understood it wasn't really about the pool. It was about what the pool represented, a woman alone who'd built something beautiful, who'd succeeded through discipline and saving and strategic choices. To someone like Karen, that kind of achievement felt like a threat. It suggested that other people's lives were theirs to improve or ruin. It suggested that beauty and worth could be created rather than inherited. That night, Margaret made a decision. She filled out the paperwork for the city permit application. 45 pages. She obtained 3 separate liability insurance quotes. She found an engineer willing to certify her pool's compliance with municipal swimming codes for a fee of $3,200. And then she did something else. Something that felt small but which would, in retrospect, be everything. She created a document on her computer. She titled it Pool Access Log and she created an entry. August 2, 2024, Tyler Whitmore, supervised site visit for educational purposes, liability waiver signed by parent. Except she hadn't had Tyler sign anything. And his parents certainly hadn't signed anything. She created a false liability waiver with David's forged signature. Margaret stared at this false document on her screen. This was illegal. This was the kind of thing that could be used against her in court. This was the exact opposite of the careful, legal-abiding person she'd been her entire life. She saved the file to a flash drive and closed the laptop. Joshua found her sitting in the dark again. He knew her well enough not to ask what she'd done. Instead, he sat next to her on the couch. "You're going to win," he said. "Mom, you always win. You just take a long time to do it." But Margaret wasn't thinking about winning anymore. She was thinking about something sharper, colder, more efficient than winning. She was thinking about the documents she'd falsified. About the leverage they would give her. About the fact that she now understood Karen's strategy so clearly that she could weaponize it in reverse. The next morning, before work, Margaret walked to the property line where Karen was doing yard work. Karen looked up, and something in her expression suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. "The pool stays," Margaret said quietly. "And if you contact the city again, or if you file any further complaints, I'll have my attorney send you documentation of your son's unsupervised access, the liability waivers you allegedly signed but didn't, and your own admission that you encouraged him to use the pool. Do you understand?" Karen's face went pale. "You wouldn't. I'm not threatening you to harm him. I'm threatening you to protect what's mine. Back off." Margaret walked back inside. She locked all the doors. She changed into her work clothes. She drove to the medical group's office where she managed the billing systems with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. And that day, something shifted in the neighborhood. Karen's truck remained in the driveway, parked at odd angles. David came home early and stayed inside with the curtains drawn. Tyler didn't appear at the pool's gate. But there was a stillness now, a tension, the quality of air right before a storm. Margaret swam that evening. The water was perfect. She did her 40 laps. And when she emerged, she saw David standing on his deck, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He looked afraid. 3 days after Margaret's confrontation with Karen, a police car appeared on Bellbrook Avenue. Margaret watched from her home office as the officer walked to the Whitmore house. She watched Karen answer the door, watched the officer holding his notepad, watched David appear behind Karen, his face darkening. She closed the blinds. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. It was Patricia, her attorney. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the absolute truth. Did you falsify any documents related to Tyler Whitmore's access to your pool?" Margaret's heart stopped. "Why?" she asked carefully. "Because David Whitmore just filed a police report alleging that you provided him with forged liability waivers showing his signature on documents he never signed. He's claiming that you're fabricating evidence of consent to create leverage in your dispute." The room spun slightly. Did you?" Margaret sat down. The morning light came through the office window, pale and accusing. "Yes," she said. "But only after they threatened to take my pool." "Jesus, Margaret. That's not how this works. That's the opposite of how this works. You just gave them actual legal grounds against you. Forgery. Fraud. Documentation tampering. I did it to protect myself. You did it illegally. Margaret, listen to me. You need to come clean before this gets worse. You need to call David and admit what you did, and you need to do it before I talk to him. You need to preempt this, control the narrative, take responsibility." Margaret felt something break inside her, not quite her will, but her sense of certainty. She'd been so sure she was right. She'd been so sure that her pool, her property, her carefully built life deserved protection. But the law didn't care about what you deserved. The law only cared about what you could prove. She called David. She asked him to meet her. He refused. She asked him to let her explain. He said his attorney was handling it. His attorney, because of course he had an attorney now, hired by Karen weeks ago, sitting and waiting for Margaret to make the mistake that would justify the entire campaign against her. That evening, Joshua found his mother in the backyard at sunset. The police came, Margaret said. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Joshua sat on the edge of the pool deck, removing his shoes and letting his feet dangle in the water. "I'm sorry," he said. "Mom, I'm really sorry. This is my fault. If I hadn't talked to Tyler, if I hadn't brought him into it. This isn't your fault. I feel like it is." They sat together in the darkening light, neither speaking, both looking at the pool as though it had transformed into something monstrous, as though the water had become a threat rather than a sanctuary. The next morning, Margaret hired Patricia to negotiate a settlement. Patricia was sharp and efficient and immediately understood that there was no way for this to end well for Margaret if it went to trial. The forged documents were the problem. The forged documents would define everything. Patricia called David's attorney, a woman named Jennifer Chen, no relation, who worked for a firm that Margaret quickly learned specialized in property disputes and civil litigation. Jennifer was polite and merciless. "My client is willing to drop the police complaint," Jennifer said, "if your client agrees to one of the following: install a locked gate with a 4-digit combination changed monthly, create a log of anyone accessing the pool, maintain liability insurance for $2 million covering the pool facility, or drain the pool entirely." "That's not a settlement," Patricia said. "That's surrender. Then we go to court." The forged documents are remarkable. They suggest either incompetence or malice. Either way, my client will seek damages, and he has a strong case. Margaret listened to this conversation on speaker phone in Patricia's office. The walls seemed to be closing inward. What if she admits to the forgery? Patricia asked. Proactively. Takes responsibility. Makes a restitution offer. Then we consider it. But the police complaint goes forward regardless. That's my client's decision, not mine. When the call ended, Patricia turned to Margaret with the expression of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "You have 72 hours to decide. Drain the pool or accept the conditions. If neither happens, they file the police report and you're facing forgery charges." Margaret called Joshua at work. "I'm draining it," she said. "Mom, no." "Yes. It's done. I'm calling Marcus." Marcus came the next day, and Margaret stood in her backyard with a shovel, watching as the man who'd built her masterpiece began to dismantle it. The water went down slowly at first, then faster, the pump creating a hollow sound, the interior becoming visible in layers, the deep end, the zero edge that had seemed to dissolve into the landscape, the subtle slope that she'd spent months perfecting. It took 8 hours. By evening, her pool was an empty basin, the interior paint exposed and faded, looking suddenly cheap and desperate in a way it never had when filled with water. That night, Joshua came home and found his mother sitting on the pool deck, her feet dangling into the emptiness. "I'm going back to school," Joshua said. "Dad called. He said he'd pay for a master's program if I wanted to do something in architecture. Maybe landscape. Maybe I could actually learn something from what happened here." Margaret looked at her son. At his youth. At the fact that he was trying to extract meaning from catastrophe. "That's good," she said. "You should do that." She didn't tell him that she'd also called her ex-husband that afternoon. That David had, surprisingly, agreed to increase child support and provide for Joshua's education without being asked to. That there were some humans who did contain traces of decency, even when given the opportunity to exploit others' vulnerability. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Margaret replanted the empty pool bed with native shrubs and grasses, turning it into a meditation garden. It was functional. It was fine. It required no permits and no liability and no protection from the predatory observation of neighbors. But it wasn't hers in the way the pool had been. 2 weeks after the pool was drained, Margaret received a letter. It came via certified mail. It was from David Whitmore, and it informed her that he and Karen had purchased a different property, a larger house in a different neighborhood. They would be relocating in 60 days. The letter ended with a single sentence: "We wish you well in your home." Margaret held the letter for a long time. She didn't feel relieved. She felt something more complicated, the absence of fear mixed with the absence of purpose. That evening, she sat in her living room and thought about what she'd learned. That people like Karen existed not to create anything but to redistribute what others had created. That the world rewarded not the builders but the litigators. That sometimes the cost of defending yourself became more expensive than the loss. She thought about the forged documents. About how desperate she'd become. About the way she'd been willing to step outside her own ethics to protect something that was ultimately just water and concrete. Joshua came home around 9 p.m. He sat next to his mother without speaking. "Are you going to sell the house?" he asked. "I don't know," Margaret said. "I don't know what I want anymore." "The pool wasn't the point," Joshua said. "The point was that you built it. You created something. Nobody can take that from you." But Margaret wasn't sure that was true. She'd already discovered that what you created could be threatened, contested, litigated, and destroyed. And the act of defending it could change you into someone you didn't recognize. She looked at her son and understood, with sudden clarity, that he was the only thing she'd built that truly mattered. The pool had been proxy for something else, proof of her worth, her competence, her right to exist in a space that was ostensibly hers but which had revealed itself to be shared with observers, with judges, with the relentless scrutiny of people who wanted what you had. The Whitmore's departure was quiet and efficient. They left on a Saturday morning in early September, a moving truck backing down Bellbrook Avenue with the careful precision of a surgical procedure. Margaret watched from her kitchen window, careful not to be seen watching. By afternoon, it was as though they'd never been there. But the damage lingered. The meditation garden she'd planted was sparse and struggling, not yet established enough to thrive on its own. The neighborhood, which had once felt like home, now felt like a place where Margaret was a subject of observation, a cautionary tale, the woman whose pride had preceded her fall. 2 weeks later, Joshua came home with news. "I ran into Tyler at the mall," he said. "He wanted to talk to you. He said he finally found out what happened." "What do you mean?" "He said he overheard his parents arguing. Like, badly. He said his mom had kept all these records and photos of your pool, had hired the lawyer months before, and his dad didn't find out until after the police report was filed. Tyler said his dad was furious. He said his mom had done the whole thing without telling him." Margaret sat down. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "David filed the police report." "No," Joshua said carefully. "His mom did. She filed it under both their names. She had his signature forged on the police report." The irony was so complete, so surgical, that Margaret almost laughed. Karen had done to David exactly what Margaret had done to them. Tyler said his parents have been fighting constantly. He said his dad told his mom he wanted a divorce. He said the whole reason they were moving was because they couldn't stand each other anymore, and they thought they needed space to figure things out. Margaret felt something shift inside her, not quite justice, but its shadow. "Did Tyler say anything else?" "He said he was sorry. He said he really did like learning about the pool. He said his mom told him you were being selfish and that he needed to understand that some people have to learn lessons about community. He said he believed her until he found out she'd lied to his dad." That night, Margaret did something she hadn't done since the pool had been drained. She poured a glass of wine and sat in her backyard, looking at the garden that was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to grow. She thought about Karen. About the specific kind of hunger that drove someone to destroy what they couldn't have, to weaponize their children, to forge documents and file false reports. About the way those actions had destroyed her own marriage, because David had discovered that his wife had lied to him, had manipulated him, had made him complicit in something he didn't actually believe in. In destroying Margaret's pool, Karen had destroyed her own family. It wasn't justice. It was too random, too collateral. Tyler was suffering. David was suffering. Margaret was suffering. The only person who'd won was the attorney, who was billing hours to both sides. But it was something. It was the universe's indifference manifesting in observable consequences. The next day, Margaret called Patricia. "Can I withdraw the settlement agreement?" she asked. "With what? The pool is already drained. The insurance is already terminated. There's nothing left to settle. The police report." Patricia understood immediately. If the Whitmores are gone, and David isn't pursuing it, then technically the report just sits. It doesn't go anywhere. They have to move forward for it to become anything real. Could I contact him? Could I ask him to drop it? You could. But Margaret, that's going to put you back in contact with this situation. You need to move forward. You need to start healing. But Margaret had never been good at healing. She'd always been good at understanding. At analyzing. At taking action. She looked up David Whitmore's number online. She called it on a Thursday evening, expecting him not to answer. He did. "Mr. Whitmore, this is Margaret Chen. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to ask you something directly." There was a pause. She could hear him breathing, calculating, deciding whether to hang up. "What?" he finally said. "Did you actually want to file that police report? Or did your wife file it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Why are you asking?" "Because I think you're a good person who got caught in your wife's manipulation. And I think you deserve to know that I've learned that I am also a person who was willing to do terrible things to protect what I thought was mine. I'm not trying to excuse what you did. I'm trying to tell you that I understand how it happened." David laughed, but it was a broken sound. "She took out a second mortgage on the house," he said quietly. "Did you know that? To pay the attorney. She did it without telling me. I found out when the bank called about a missed payment. My wife took out $100,000 loan to fight with you about a pool." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "I didn't know." "Yeah. Well. Now you do. And now we're getting divorced, and now I'm the idiot who filed a police report against you in order to satisfy my wife's obsession with destroying something beautiful that wasn't hers to begin with. I falsified documents," Margaret said. "I forged liability waivers. I'm not innocent. I know. My attorney told me about the forgery. And you know what I said? I said I didn't care. I said drop the police report, let it go, I'm not doing this anymore." He paused. "She's appealing my decision. We're supposed to be mediating the divorce through the courts. My attorney says she's trying to use the police report as leverage to get a better settlement." Margaret understood then that she was looking at her own potential future, if she'd stayed married to a man who valued his ego more than her peace of mind. If she'd chosen a partnership based on comfort rather than respect. If she'd built a life that depended on someone else's agreement about what was real and true. "I'm sorry," Margaret said. "So am I." They didn't talk for long after that. But something had shifted in the conversation between them, an understanding that they were both victims of Karen's hunger, which was really just an extreme version of the hunger that lived in all humans, the desire to have what others had, to control what couldn't be controlled, to transform the world into something that reflected your own needs. The week after that conversation, David Whitmore's attorney sent notice that the police report would be withdrawn, contingent on a non-disclosure agreement preventing either party from discussing the matter publicly. Margaret signed it without reading it carefully. She was too tired to care about the fine print anymore. 6 months after the pool was drained, Margaret's meditation garden was finally becoming recognizable as intentional landscaping. The native shrubs had established themselves. The grasses had grown tall and wild. She'd added a flagstone path and a simple bench, positioned to face west, where the sun set over the neighboring yards. She sat on that bench every evening after work. Joshua had moved into his own apartment and had enrolled in a graduate program in landscape architecture. He came home once a week for dinner, and they'd sit in the garden together, and he'd talk about his classes, his projects, his dreams of designing spaces that healed rather than displayed. "I think I learned from what happened," Joshua said one evening in late February. "I learned that the spaces we make are supposed to nourish us, not prove something to other people." "That's very wise," Margaret said. "I got that from you. From watching you try to protect something you'd built. From watching you be willing to destroy your own ethics to defend it." Margaret understood that this was Joshua's way of processing the damage. That he'd internalized the lesson and transformed it into something that would shape the architecture of his future. On a Tuesday in early March, as spring was finally becoming visible in the tentative green of emerging plants, there was a knock on Margaret's door. She opened it to find Tyler Whitmore, dressed in a button-down shirt, holding a portfolio folder. "Hi, Margaret," he said. His voice had deepened since summer. "I wanted to show you something." She invited him in. She made him tea. And Tyler opened his portfolio to reveal detailed sketches, renderings, and architectural plans. They were all variations on pool designs, different shapes, different materials, different approaches to creating a space that seemed to dissolve into the landscape. "I'm doing my senior thesis on zero-edge residential pools and their psychological impact on homeowners," Tyler said. "I wanted to do it on your pool before. These are beautiful," Margaret said, and meant it. "I wanted you to know that I didn't know what my mom was doing. I believed her when she said you were being generous. I believed her when she said you wanted me to learn from you. And when I found out the truth, I felt like I'd betrayed you somehow, even though I was just a kid doing what my parents told me." Margaret looked at this young man, who was carrying the weight of his mother's actions while still maintaining his own integrity. "You didn't betray me. Your mother did. There's a difference. I know that now. But I wanted you to see that what you created, the pool, the design, it actually did reach someone. It actually did change someone. Me. It made me want to spend my life creating spaces that people love, that make them feel like they're part of something larger than themselves." He pointed to one of his renderings, a pool design that was unmistakably inspired by Margaret's original vision, but which incorporated new elements, new ideas, the evolution of a concept. "This is for you," he said. "Not a physical pool. But the intellectual continuation. You built something beautiful, and it inspired someone else to understand how to create beauty. That's legacy. That's worth something." When Tyler left that evening, he hugged Margaret. It was awkward and genuine, and it was the closest thing she'd received to what felt like redemption. She hung his rendering on her kitchen wall, the one place where she looked every day. Not to prove something to anyone. Just to remember that beauty created is never entirely lost, even when the physical manifestation is destroyed. Spring turned fully green. The garden had become genuinely beautiful now, not the manicured perfection of the pool-era backyard, but something wilder, more organic, more alive. Plants grew together in combinations that Margaret hadn't planned but which worked nonetheless. She started having Joshua and his girlfriend over for dinner regularly. She started asking her coworkers to come to her house on Friday evenings. Nothing formal. Nothing designed to impress. Just people sitting in a backyard, talking about their lives, existing together in a space that was beautiful not because it was perfect, but because it was honestly maintained, genuinely inhabited, and shared openly. One evening in late May, a real estate agent pulled up to the house. Margaret had contacted her the week before. But now, standing in the driveway, Margaret realized she wasn't ready to sell. "Actually," she said, "I'm not moving. The agent looked confused. But you called. I know. I was running. I was trying to escape the memory of what happened. But the thing is, this is my house. This is where I've lived. This is where I've learned who I am when I'm not defending myself or protecting something I'm afraid to lose. The agent left. Margaret went into her backyard. She sat on the bench in the meditation garden and watched the light move across the space. She thought about the pool. About how much she'd wanted it to define her life. About how losing it had, paradoxically, saved her. She thought about Karen, still unseen but existing somewhere in the world, likely creating new dramas, new victims, new wars about territory and worth. Margaret felt something like pity for her, the kind of profound sadness that comes from understanding that some people will never know how to build anything, only how to destroy. And she thought about David, who'd been forced to confront his own complacency, who was now, presumably, building a different kind of life in the ruins of his marriage. Most of all, she thought about the fact that she'd survived. That she'd made terrible decisions and faced consequences and learned from them and emerged different, not better, exactly, but more honest. More real. Less dependent on external validation. Joshua came home that evening and found his mother in the garden. "So you decided to stay?" he asked. "I decided to stop running. There's a difference." They sat together as the sun began its descent. The native plants swayed gently in the evening breeze. Birds nested in the shrubs. The whole space had become a small ecosystem, regenerating itself, requiring less effort the more Margaret let it be what it wanted to become. "I'm proud of you," Joshua said. "For what?" "For making terrible decisions. For falsifying documents. For letting someone manipulate me so thoroughly. For surviving it. For being honest about what you did. For not letting it define you forever." Margaret leaned her head against her son's shoulder. She was 58 years old. She'd built a home and a career and a son who understood compassion and consequence in equal measure. She'd been broken and repaired and was still standing. It wasn't the ending she would have written for herself. It was messier, less triumphant, more complicated than narrative arc typically allowed. But it was real. On a Tuesday in June, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was from David Whitmore. The divorce had been finalized. He'd moved back into the city, into an apartment with a view of the river. He'd quit his job and started working for a nonprofit that built affordable housing. "I wanted you to know," his letter said, "that I've learned something from all of this. That we have more control than we think over what we allow into our lives. That complicity isn't the same as consent, but it's also not blameless. That sometimes the people we're supposed to trust are the ones doing the most damage. And that starting over is possible, but only if you're willing to stop defending who you thought you were and start becoming who you actually are." He'd included a photograph. It showed a small community garden in the city, filled with raised beds and plants and people. David was in the photograph, kneeling in the dirt, planting something green. Margaret pinned the letter and photograph next to Tyler's rendering on her kitchen wall. And in the garden, the plants continued to grow. The neighborhood had cycled through several new families. Bellbrook Avenue had returned to its ordinary rhythms, dogs barking, children playing, the quiet maintenance of suburban life. Margaret's home had become something of a gathering place. Not because she'd sought it out, but because the garden had become increasingly beautiful, and people were drawn to beauty the way they were drawn to light. Joshua had graduated with his master's degree and had taken a position with a firm that specialized in ecological landscaping. His first major project was a residential property where the client specifically requested something inspired by natural systems rather than formal design. Margaret attended the unveiling. The space was stunning, but more than that, it was alive. Plants supported insects, which supported birds, which transformed the property into a small pocket of ecosystem restoration. "This wouldn't have happened without what happened to you," Joshua said to his mother. "Good can emerge from bad circumstances," Margaret replied. "But it requires intention. It requires choosing to learn instead of choosing to defend. The house next to hers had new owners, a young couple who were fixing it up slowly, respectfully, in the same spirit that Margaret had first approached her own property before she'd become obsessed with perfection. They'd invited her to dinner. She'd invited them to her garden. They were building something small and good together, the way neighbors were perhaps supposed to do. Late one evening in September, as the light took on that particular golden quality that precedes autumn, Margaret was watering her plants when a car pulled up to the curb. She recognized it immediately, the familiar shape, the slightly broken muffler that needed repair. It was Karen. She looked different. Smaller, somehow, and more worn than Margaret remembered. She was alone in the car. Margaret turned off the hose. She didn't move. She didn't invite Karen in. Karen got out of the car slowly and approached the fence. She didn't try to open the gate. "I wanted to apologize," Karen said. Her voice was thin, uncertain. "I've been thinking about what I did. What I put you through. What I put David through." Margaret waited. "The new house didn't work out," Karen continued. "David and I are divorcing. Tyler won't talk to me because of how I treated you and because I lied to him. I've been seeing a therapist, and she helped me understand that I was trying to fill an emptiness in myself by tearing down what you'd built. Is that supposed to matter?" Margaret asked quietly. "No," Karen said. "I don't think it is. I think what I did was unforgivable. I think I destroyed something beautiful because it made me feel small. And I've come to understand that no apology will ever be adequate. But I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. And that I wanted you to know that what you built, the pool, the home, the life, it was worth something. It was valuable. And I was wrong to try to take it from you." Karen's hands were shaking. Margaret looked at this woman and felt nothing, not anger, not pity, not vindication. Just a kind of neutral recognition that they were two humans who'd occupied space together and caused each other pain, and that neither of them was any longer shaped by what had happened between them. "I hope you find peace," Margaret said. "Genuine peace, not the kind that comes from destroying someone else's life." Karen nodded. She got back in her car. She drove away. Margaret stood in her garden in the fading light and felt the weight lift from her shoulders, a weight she hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. She thought about the pool. About how much she'd needed it and how fully she'd survived its loss. About the falsified documents and the legal warfare and the way that defending herself had almost turned her into someone unrecognizable. And she thought about how the garden, which had started as a replacement, as a lesser thing, had become something more valuable, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was true. She picked up her watering can and continued her evening ritual. She watered the plants that had grown strong enough to need less attention, that had established their own root systems, that were now part of the living world rather than just a display of her competence. Joshua came by the next evening, and they sat in the garden together. Karen came by, Margaret told him. She apologized. "What did you say?" "That I hope she finds peace." Joshua nodded. "Do you believe she will?" "I don't know," Margaret said. "But I believe I will. And that's enough." They sat in the garden as darkness fell, and the plants settled into their nighttime rest, and the neighborhood quieted around them. Margaret thought about legacy. About what we build. About how the things we create can be taken from us, but the act of creating, the understanding that we're capable of building something beautiful, that can never be destroyed. In the morning, she would water her garden. In a week, she would host dinner. In a month, Joshua would show her plans for his next project. In a year, the plants would have grown larger. In 5 years, this space would be fully established, a real ecosystem, a breathing thing.